Hello. So, our project for REN 250 was on the Upper Paraná Basin, done by myself, Brady, Logan, Gabby, and Ty. In this presentation, we will, we will begin by discussing the physical, ecological, and human watershed characteristics. Next, talking about stakeholders and conflicts. From this, we will discuss the Itaipu Dam, resolution efforts, and finally, the current state of the watershed. To begin, let's talk about the physical geography of the basin. So this basin extends over an area of 900,000 square kilometers. It includes mainly parts of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. It is fed by major tributaries such as the Tietê and Paraná rivers. Since the 1980s, land cover has shifted significantly. Cropland makes up 46% of the region, pastures are 25.6%, and native evergreen forests are 20%. Land cover changes have been strongly influenced by the expansion of eucalyptus plantations, among other agriculturally important crops. These dramatic land use changes have had significant impacts on habitats along with water demand and quality. The plantain expansions have also displaced many indigenous peoples and caused great loss in traditional lands. Ecologically, a notable ecosystem that the Upper Paraná Basin has are its polygenic floodplains. These plains host very high levels of biodiversity due to its periodical nature and high levels of nutrients. Since the streams that drain into these floodplains are carrying a lot of sediment, they often settle here, creating very fertile lands. The floodplains that are connected to the Paraná River serve as culturally significant lands for the Guarani people, who have an inherent spiritual and functional connection to the river and its floodplains. Looking at the hydrological regime in the basin, the main water source is the Guarani Aquifer, which is over 1.2 million square kilometers. This region experiences wet and dry seasons, with the wet season lasting from October to April and the dry season starting in May and ending in September. During the wet season, the floodplains typically fill with water. However, due to damming, water movement is much more controlled. This has impacted ecosystem function and biodiversity. This includes decreased floodplain flooding, barriers for fish migration, and creation of unnatural flow regimes for the streams here. Looking at the human geography, the Upper Paraná Basin is home to 63 million people, 93% of which are located in urban centers. This, along with agricultural activities, put great strain on the watershed. Indigenous groups here include the Timbuas, Chanas, Coranda, and Guarani people, just to name a few.
Water quality is declining due to pesticide runoff, sediment loads, and industrial waste. Nutrients accumulate midstream while damming disrupts natural flushing systems. These stressors impact both human health and aquatic life. Water quality is a major concern. Brazil's pesticide use is 3 times the global average. chemicals like cypermethrin, atrazine, glyphosate, and newer neonicotinoids contaminate rivers, bind to sediments, and accumulate in aquatic life. These toxins are linked to biodiversity loss and serious human health effects. 1 in 4 Brazilian municipalities have pesticide-contaminated drinking water. The Upper Paraná is at high risk given current land use trajectories. The Upper Paraná floodplains are polygenetic systems, or mosaics of interconnected wetlands. These areas are sacred to indigenous communities like the Guarani, who rely on the river for spiritual and material sustenance. Stakeholders range from powerful agribusinesses interests to marginalized indigenous communities. While forestry and agriculture expand, local and scientific voices are often sidelined in policymaking. Water use is highly contested. Agribusiness and forestry industries are expanding rapidly, hydropower drives, national energy needs, and cities depend on clean water. But indigenous and rural communities like the Guarani and the Quilombola peoples often lack access and decision-making power. Despite environmental regulations, enforcement remains weak. Indigenous and Afro-descent groups like the Quilombola are excluded from governance. Economic goals often outweigh ecological or social considerations.
The Itaipu Dam is a hydroelectric dam located on the Paraná River at the border between Brazil and Paraguay. It is one of the world's largest sources of renewable energy, generating nearly 10% of Brazil's electricity and 90% of Paraguay's. Its construction arose from conflict between the two countries who both wanted to exploit the untapped potential energy of the watershed. Joint ownership of the land was determined under the Act of Iguaçu in 1966 and the Treaty of Itaipu, which allocated costs and resources for both parties. The Itaipu Binational was created to pursue the construction of the dam, which began in 1971 and finished in 1984. Disputes over the allocation of resources between Brazil and Paraguay were constant, but were mostly resolved on smaller scales. The government of Argentina also had their own issues with the dam, as it negatively affected their downstream flow, which damaged their own energy usage, agriculture, and fishing. This conflict was resolved in 1979 with the tripartite Itaipu Corpus Agreement, where flow levels were required to be maintained above a certain level. In terms of environmental destruction, the Guaira Falls, which was the greatest volume of falling water in the world at this point, was submerged by an artificial lake and destroyed in order to make space to build the dam. The falls were once a barrier between freshwater species, and their destruction negatively affected the biodiversity due to the ecosystem conflicts caused by introducing these species together. The river itself was rerouted to allow a section of the riverbed to dry for the construction of the dam, which disrupted the ecosystem there. After the completion of the dam, the release of water from the reservoirs affected natural flow patterns, which was harmful towards aquatic life and the ecosystem. The release of heated water from the dam changes the temperature of the water, which makes it less viable for the species who live there. Likewise, farmers in the area have claimed that due to the heat from the dam, the lands around the reservoir have seen an increase of around 4 degrees Celsius. This has led to decreased animal fertility, lesser value of the land, and decreased soy production by approximately 30% since 1984. Brazilian farmers have sought out legal action against the government of Brazil in the Itaipu Binational in the early 2000s, but were unsuccessful. During the construction of the dam, indigenous groups were fundamentally excluded from the decision-making process, and their history with the land and their knowledge about the functioning and the ecology of the area was undermined. When the floodgates first opened, 10,000 indigenous families living in the area were forcefully displaced from their cultural lands when their homes and farms were flooded. Because the dam is a major source of energy, few conversations have been had about ceasing operations, but efforts have been made to ensure better environmental compliance and sustainable operations. The Brazilian government uses parts of the proceeds generated from the sales of extra hydroelectric power for social and environmental protections for habitats and communities around the dam reservoir, which was prescribed by the Brazilian Constitution of 1988 and legislature that allocates the largest share of revenues towards areas most impacted by the dam. Likewise, the Brazilian Forest Code now requires landholders to maintain riparian buffers, which are called Areas of Permanent Preservation, or APPs. Paraguay also has deforestation laws that prescribe the required maintenance of 25% of forests and the retention of riparian buffers, which tackles uncontrolled deforestation amongst corporations and farmers. The Itaipu Binational, the company who owns the dam, has been conducting environmental protection activities as mandated by the Brazilian and Paraguay governments in 2005, such as water quality control, agriculture and fishing protections, and the creation of biodiversity areas. External companies like the World Bank have contributed significant funding to restore riparian habitats, but large-scale efforts to restore these have been unsuccessful due to the scale of the issues and the stakeholders involved. Indigenous groups are still in the process of seeking reparations and reconciliation from the land loss and violation of their rights. Specifically, their historical land is still inhospitable, and they have been banned from any attempts to return living there. The government violated their rights to the land, which are incredibly culturally significant to their livelihoods, and the Itaipu Binational has refused accountability towards restoring the damage they have caused and acknowledging the depth of the issue. However, in the future, the laws and regulations established over the course of the construction of the dam that arose from the damage it caused have set the scene for better management and ecological considerations for future ventures and projects involving the watershed. It better implies the ethical questions that must be considered for projects like this, such as the livelihoods of the peoples living around the areas and the viability of the ecosystems they are altering. However, lots of harms cannot be undone, such as the destruction of the Guaira Falls, the ecosystem disruption in both the water and the forests due to the deforestation, temperature changes, and water flow changes in the dam's reservoir. However, one major success is the implementation of more preservation areas around the dam due to the recognition of the forest's importance in sediment trapping and altering surface runoff in the smooth functioning of the dam. These efforts to maintain the dam have had unintended but positive effects on the biodiversity of the area.
In the current state of the Upper Paraná River Basin, economic priorities are often outweighed by ecological concerns, leading to deforestation, groundwater depletion, and ultimately biodiversity loss. Environmental laws exist, like riparian buffer regulations, but the enforcement on them is weak. Indigenous groups, like the Quilombola, are often excluded from decision-making, while agriculture continues their unsustainable practices. Some restoration efforts do exist, including World Bank funding and the Itaipu environmental programs, but they've had mixed success from the scale and complexity of the ecosystem. What we see in this watershed is an extractive and not regenerative economic model. To improve, we need stronger enforcement of land and water policies, stricter deforestation laws, and inclusive governance that respects indigenous rights. Transitioning towards climate-resilient agriculture will reduce the reliance on water-intensive crops like eucalyptus and soy. It can help bring balance to economic and ecological needs. Scientists, indigenous, and local communities must also have a greater role in shaping policy to ensure long-term sustainability of the environment. Without these changes, degradation of the environment will continue. True integrated watershed management acknowledges that land use, water, energy, and rights are all deeply interlinked. Protecting ecosystems requires addressing societal inequalities and making room for all the voices to be heard, especially those who have been long silenced. Sustainability isn't only about conservation, it's also about social justice. Only through collaboration and equitable policies can we achieve a future where economic, ecological, and social goals are all balanced, and that is what integrated watershed management should strive for.